In this lecture, we're going to look at how we can use the router with the Composition API. All official libraries released by the Vue dev team support the Composition API. If you decide to use the Composition API, you may need to use some of the methods and properties available by these libraries. We're going to start with the router. The router exposes information such as the route parameters or queries. We saw examples of how we might need these properties during the master project. The router comes with hooks for accessing its properties when we need them. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a zip file you can download. Download it, unzip the files, install the dependencies, and start the server. Pause the video if you need to. Let's break down what's in the starter files. The project contains the basic configuration for the router and Vuex modules. If we look in the app component file, we'll find two links to the home and about page. Below them is the router view component to render the page content. Inside the views directory, we'll find the components for both pages. If you look at either components, they're rendering static heading messages. There's nothing special about them. Other than that, nothing special is happening with our project. Let's view the project in the browser. We'll find the links with the page content below them. We can switch between pages by clicking on the link. So far, so good. For this demonstration, let's attempt to make the About page more dynamic. Open the index file in the router directory. Let's update the About page to render information about a specific user. We'll start by updating the route for the About page. There are different ways we can make a route dynamic. The most common approach is to use route parameters. We'll add a route parameter at the end of the path. The name of the router parameter will be member. The route parameter we're creating will contain the name of the member. Let's open the About component file. We can access the route parameters through the $route object. This object is available in the template. We'll update the heading message to output the params.member parameter. Next, we'll go back to the app component file. We're going to update the link to the About page. We'll update the link to point to a non-existent member called admin. If we did everything right, we should be able to view the name of the member on the page. Let's open the About page in the browser to find out. As expected, the name is rendered on the page. The way we write templates doesn't change with the Composition API. The information about a route is accessible via the $route object. However, what if we wanted to access the route information in the setup function? This is where changes slightly differ. Let's go back to the About component file. We'll add the script block to the component file. In the exported object, we'll define the setup function. In some cases, we may need to access the router parameter in this function, or we may need the query parameters if they exist. We don't have access to the $router object because it's exposed via the this keyword. If we want access to the route information, we'll need to use hooks. Previously, we learned how to create custom hooks with the Composition API. Hooks are functions that export properties and methods that we can merge with our component's setup function. The router library comes with its own set of hook functions we can call to merge with our component. At the top of the script block, we'll add an import statement for the Vue router module. The composable function we'll want to import is called useRoute. Notice how the name of the function starts with the word use. It's common practice to add the word use to hook functions to help indicate that this function is a hook. It's meant to be called within a component's setup function to merge additional functions and properties. The router library exposes its methods and properties through hooks. The hook we're importing will let us access the route object. In our setup function, we'll declare a variable called route. Its value will be the useRoute function. The route object will have the same properties you would normally find on the $route object. For example, let's say we want to use the member route parameter. Below this function, we'll log the route.params.member property. Let's refresh the page in the browser with the console opened. In the console, the name of the member gets logged. Perfect. Hooks are probably the most common feature you'll find yourself using with the Composition API. Most libraries will provide their own hooks we can use to extend our components. Let's explore another hook by the router library. The useRoute hook will expose information about the route. Other times, we may need to interact with the router, such as changing the current route. We'll need to use a different hook. Back in the editor, let's update the import statement for the viewRouter package. We'll import a hook function called useRouter. The useRouter function will return an object we can use to interact with the router. It's the same as the $router object we worked with previously. In our setup function, we'll create a variable called router. Its value will be the useRouter function. For this demonstration, we'll add a hash to the router. Below the log, we'll call the router.push function. We'll pass in an object. The object will have one property called hash. Its value will be #test. The push function, as we've learned, will update the router, primarily used to redirect the visitor to a different route. In this instance, we're adding a hash to the current route. Let's refresh the browser to view the changes. In the address bar, we can see that the hash has been added. The router library has exposed two hooks if we ever need information about the current route or interact with the router. It's important to know this stuff because it's likely that you won't be using Vue alone. You may need to work with the router. That's the basics of working with the router with the Composition API. We'll leave it at that. In the next one, we'll continue with the Composition API.